Blind Paul, blessed Paul, who gathers us together today, enlightened the earth, and it was precisely he who, when he was called, was blinded for some time. But this blindness has been, and remains, the illumination of the world. His vision was defective, indeed, and God made him blind in a very happy way. It was to bring him back to a more rigorous vision, and moreover, God manifested his power to him at the same time as he gave him, in this accident, an image of what awaited him. He was teaching him how he would approach the proclamation of the message. He would have to reject all that was his own, and close his eyes to follow it. Hence the words that Paul himself utters to proclaim this lesson: if any of you imagine himself to be wise, let him go mad to become wise. It was because he could not regain healthy vision without having previously been healthy blinded, without having rejected the views that were his own and only served to throw him into confusion, without having returned everything to faith. But let no one hear me believe that this was a binding call, for he could have returned to the state from which he had emerged. Many men, placed before greater wonders, have turned around. And this is the case in the New as well as in the Old Testament. Think of Judas, of Nebuchadnezzar, of the Magus Elymas, of Simon, of Ananias, to Sapphire. And to the Jewish people everything derives from it, Paul accepted. Eyes fixed on the pure light, he continued his course and flew up into the sky. Do you want to know why he was blinded? Listen to him himself. You know that I once lived in Judaism, that I persecuted the church to the limit and ravaged it, and that I had an extreme position in Judaism, beyond many of people of my generation, and I had an excessive zeal for the traditions which came to me from my ancestors. With this extremely energetic, inaccessible character, he needed an even more energetic break. Otherwise, carried away by his ardor as by a torrent, he would have turned a deaf ear to the words addressed to him. So God suppresses his outbursts and begins by calming the stormy waves of his anger by striking him with blindness. Then, he converses with him, to show him the inaccessible character of his wisdom, the supereminent character of his science, and teach him to know the one he is fighting, whose sight he could not bear when he dispenses the punishment, of course, but also the bonuses. And it was not darkness that plunged him into darkness, it was the superabundance of light that enveloped him in darkness. Conversion time. But why, you will ask me, did this not happen sooner? Ah! Do not ask yourself such questions. Leave this kind of indiscretion. Grant rather to the incomprehensible providence of God that it knows how to choose the favorable moment. This is what Paul himself does when he says, "When it pleased God, who chose me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, to reveal his Son in me." So as long as Paul speaks like this, what are you wasting your time on these superfluous questions? Yes, it was the moment, if, from then on, the reasons for stumbling disappeared. On the other hand, let us learn from this example that no one, neither himself nor those who preceded him, ever found Christ by his own strength. It is Christ who has always manifested himself. Hence these words: "It is not you who have chosen me, it is I who have chosen you." For why did he not believe in seeing the dead rise in the name of Jesus Christ? He saw the lame walking, the demons fleeing, the paralytics regaining a firm step, and that was of no fruitfulness to him. He knew nothing of these miracles, he who was so curious about everything that touched the apostles. Etienne had been stoned, he was there, he saw his face like that of an angel, and it did him no good at all. How could that be of no use to him? It was because he had not yet been called. But, hearing me, don't believe that the call is a constraint. Indeed, far from exercising any kind of constraint, God leaves us masters of our decisions, once he has called us. Thus, he revealed himself to the Jews, and at the propitious moment, but they refused to receive him because of the glory which they expected from him in the eyes of men. And if some unbeliever came to me and said, Where do you get this idea, obvious to you, that God called Paul from heaven, and that this call determined him? And why didn't you call me? Me in my turn. I would answer him this: do you believe in this call, yes or no? If you believe in it, that itself is proof enough for you. For if you doubt that a call came from heaven, how can you say, why didn't he call me back? And if you believe in this call, that itself is a proof which should be sufficient for you. Have faith then, for God calls you also from heaven, but on one condition, that you are willing to obey. Tell yourself that if you are not inclined to obey, if you turn your gaze elsewhere, even a voice coming down from heaven for you will not be enough to save you. How many times, then, have the Jews heard a voice from above without trusting God? How many times have they seen signs, both in the New and in the Old Testament, without correcting themselves? Take the Old Testament. They had seen innumerable wonders, and they made their golden calf. But the courtesan of Jericho, who had seen nothing admirable like them, showed prodigious faith when it came to Joshua's spies. And in this land of promise, the signs appeared, but these Jews remained more insensitive than stones. But the inhabitants of Nineveh only had to see Jonah to have faith and effect their conversion. And this is how they diverted the wrath of God from them. In the New Testament, now, and with the very presence of Christ, the thief, seeing him crucified, adored him, but the Jews, having seen him raise the dead, made him no less a prisoner and crucified. Signs of God and impiety of the prince. And in our time, what happened? Didn't we see the fire springing from the temple in Jerusalem, from its very foundations, and falling down on the builders? And was this not enough to divert them from their sacrilegious enterprise? Well, do you believe that they changed that much, that they gave up their hardness? And how many wonders, still, without any profit for the witnesses? For example, the lightning that fell on the top of the temple of Apollo, or the gesture of the oracle himself of Apollo, forcing the then sovereign to move the remains of the martyr buried next to it. Because he could not, he said, utter the slightest word when he saw his tomb close by. And the remains of the martyr, in fact, lay quite near there. I will also cite the case of the uncle of this sovereign. He had behaved in an outrageous manner with the sacred objects of worship. He fell prey to vermin, and he died. But there is also the case of the intendant of the imperial goods, who had allowed himself another sacrilege with regard to the church, and who perished, burst in the middle. The fountains in our country, whose flow until then had been greater than that of the rivers, caused their waters to flow back, all at the same time, and they withdrew, which had never happened to them before the emperor defiled the region with its sacrifices and libations. Must I recall the famine which fell everywhere, on all the cities, with this emperor? His death, also, in Persian territory, the trap in which he fell, before dying, when his army was completely isolated, in the middle barbarians, enclosed as in a net, a trap, and incredible and unexpected thing, the return of this army? To this impious sovereign, who died in a pitiful manner, succeeded a pious man, and suddenly all the calamities disappeared. The soldiers blocked in these nets, having no longer any means of making a passage to get out of them, with the permission, henceforth, of God, were delivered from the barbarians and brought about their safe return. The cross of Christ, wonder among wonders. Are not all these prodigies enough to lead anyone to religious sentiments? And don't we currently have even more astonishing ones before our eyes? See, the cross is preached, and the whole earth hastens. An ignominious death is announced, and everyone jumps at the news. Now of the people put on the cross, were there not thousands of them? And with Christ himself were there not also 2 robbers tied to the posts? And of the sages, have we not seen them by the thousands? And powerful men? But what name has ever imposed itself as that of Christ? And what is the use of talking about wise or powerful people? See the most illustrious sovereigns, Who among them has conquered the earth in such rapid time? Oh, do not object to me the heresies, with their infinite variety. All proclaim Christ each time, and even if they do not speak of him soundly, it is indeed this crucified dead over there in Palestine, under Pontius Pilate, that we love. Do not all these facts seem to you to demonstrate even more clearly the power of God than the voice, in the famous episode, descended from heaven? How to explain that no sovereign has established his power like Christ, who imposed himself, despite the obstacles that were not lacking? Kings made war on him, princes fought him in battle. All peoples raged against him, and that did not succeed in crushing our cause. On the contrary, its prestige has become more dazzling. So tell me, from where comes such an extraordinary power? He was a magician, you will say. Here is the only mage who had such a power. You have of course heard of the Magi who peopled Persia and India, and who still people it, but their very name no longer counts for anything, and nowhere. Ah, but there is this impostor from Tyana. This famous magician, who had a great brilliance, he too, you will tell me. Or so, and when? In a corner of our world, very small, and for a very brief time, and it quickly died out. It disappeared without leaving a church, without having constituted a people, nothing resembling it. But enough about missing mages and magicians. How is it that the gods have lost their worship? All of them, the god of Dodona, the god of Claros, and that all these bad places, these infamous places, are silent, voiceless? How is it that not only the crucified, but the very bones of the people who were slaughtered for him make the demons shudder with terror? How is it that at the mere name of the cross they leap back? And certainly the cross should bring derision instead. Is it such a brilliant, such a noble reality? On the contrary, it is something shameful, despicable. It is a death inflicted on a condemned man. It is a death like there is none worse, a curse among the Jews, an abomination among the Greeks. Whence then comes the terror which it inspires in the demons, if not from the power of the crucified? Because if it is the very object that they dread in the cross, here is, rather, a reaction unworthy of their divine nature. Not to mention that before Christ there were many crucified. There were many after him, and two with him. Now, one could tell me that by invoking the name of the crucified brigand, of such and such a person placed on the cross, one will put the demon to flight. But not at all, he will laugh about it. But add to the invocation of the cross the name of Jesus of Nazareth and the demons flee, as if to escape the fire. So what can you object? Where does he come from? Would you say he was a charlatan? But the precepts he left us have nothing to do with that, and moreover charlatans, we never lacked them. Would you say he was a magician? But what we are asked to believe about him does not support this. And magicians, the cargo of them has been abundant many times. Would you say he was a sage? But the world has never lacked it. Who, among all of them, has imposed himself in this way? No one, ever, has come close to such power, however small. So, it's quite clear, it's neither like a magician, nor like a charlatan. It's more like the one who puts charlatans and magicians back on the right track. It's as if invested with a divine and invincible force. It is for this reason alone that he himself triumphed over everything, and that he breathed into this tentmaker, Paul, a force whose magnitude is attested by his actions and gestures. In the weakness of Paul and his listeners. Here is a man who stood in the marketplace, to practice leather work there, and he had the power to bring back Romans, Persians, Indians, Scythians, Ethiopians, Sarmatians, Parthians, Medes, Saracens, in short all humanity, in truth, and all this in less than 30 years. How can you explain, tell me, that a market craftsman, riveted to his workshop, accustomed to handling the knife, could have been such a master of wisdom, and with such an influence on people, peoples, cities, various countries? without manifesting the slightest oratorical science. On the contrary, with the greatest ignorance, and ignorant in this field he was. Listen to him, then, when he says without any shame, "If I have no particular training in eloquence, it is not the same for science." And he had no personal property, he admits it himself. Until now, we suffer hunger and thirst, nudity and ill treatment. And when I talk about personal property, I should rather say, quite simply, that he didn't even have the necessary food, very often, nor what to cover himself with. That his job had nothing to make him someone in sight is what his disciple proves when he gives this detail. He lived with Aquilus and Priscilla, because their job was his. They made tents. Nor was it his ancestry that set him apart. Would he otherwise have practiced that profession? Neither the country nor the race to which he belonged. Well, in spite of that, he had only to appear, to come forward, to throw trouble, totally, among his enemies, to sow utter confusion. It looked like fire falling on straw or hay. It reduced the positions of the demons to ashes. It transformed everything at will. What to admire? To see him, with so few assets, manifesting such power, yes, but there are also his disciples. For the most part poor people, whom nothing distinguished, uneducated, people who were not eating at their hunger, obscure and of obscure origin. He makes it known himself to whoever wants it, and he is not ashamed of their poverty, even less of claiming help for them. I am going to Jerusalem, to bring help to the saints. Another testimony to this effect. Everyone should put aside at home what they have saved on the first day of the week, so that they won't wait for my arrival to collect donations. What proves that most of his disciples were people whom nothing at all distinguished, is this passage from a letter to the Corinthians. Consider the call of which you are the object. There is not much wise according to the flesh, nor many powerful, nor many well-born. And not only do they not come from great backgrounds, but they are quite humble people. What is weak in the world is what God has chosen, what is not, to reduce to nothing what is. Well, you will say, here is someone uneducated. Here is an ordinary man, but after all, he did have, to a certain degree at least, the talent to persuade. As for me, I did not come to announce to you the testimony of God with the prestige of the word or of wisdom. I didn't want to know anything except Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ crucified. My word and my message have nothing of the persuasive speeches of wisdom. The message he proclaimed was enough to magnetize people. Listen to him himself on this subject. While the Jews ask for signs and the Greeks seek wisdom, we announce a crucified Christ, a scandal for the Jews, madness for the Greeks. But he had at least, will you say, all tranquility for his preaching? Not. He never breathed safe from danger. Yes, I presented myself to you weak, fearful and full of fear. Such was his lot. But it was the same for his disciples too. Remember, he said, those first days when you were enlightened to know, afterwards, a great onslaught of suffering. Sometimes you were exposed in public to opprobrium and vexations. Sometimes you showed solidarity with those who were thus treated. You welcomed with joy the spoliation of your goods. And this is what he said to the Thessalonians this time. You suffered from your compatriots exactly what we ourselves suffered from the Jews. They put the Lord to death, persecuted their prophets, and then they do not please God and are the enemies of all. And to the Corinthians he wrote again, the sufferings of Christ abound for us. And just as you share in the sufferings, so you are associated with the consolation. And to the Galatians, have you suffered so much in vain? If it is true that you could have suffered in vain. Well, here is a man who proclaims the message, and he is poor, he is an ordinary man, and his message has nothing to seduce, and everything to scandalize. Here are listeners who are poor people, too. And poor people, people of nothing. Behold, dangers continually follow dangers, beating down on the masters, beating down on the disciples. Behold, the man announced is crucified. What could have brought about the triumph? Is it not obvious that it is a divine and ineffable power? But it is obvious to everyone. Bursts forth the power of the crucified. Here, think about what Paul had in front of him, and you will understand him perfectly. Facing him, it's the opposite situation, and on the whole line, we have wealth, we are from a great background. From a powerful country, we have the resources of rhetoric, complete freedom of action, a swarm of people at your command. We quickly stifle any attempt to open up new paths. And despite these advantages, one must bow before the others, starting from an opposite situation. Then, tell me, how to explain this? Imagine an analogous case, with several army corps. A whole armament, troops well arrayed in battle. A king is incapable of triumphing over foreign armies. And here is a miserable man, without any equipment, alone, without the slightest javelin. Not even a garment, only has to present himself to succeed where the others had failed with all their armament, all their device. So, renounce your error, give, without failing a single day, all your votes to the crucified, adore his power. After all, a general executes a whole plan around several cities, surrounds them with ditches, brings siege engines near the ramparts, causes arms to flow, enlists troops, while disposing of immense financial resources for all this, and he does not fail to drop a single one, and a man goes on the attack, without any weapon on him. He uses only his hands, and he goes not against a city, or two, nor against 20, but against 100, against 1,000, on all the earth, and he seizes with all their inhabitants. It would not even occur to you to say that it is the work of a human force. And it is indeed the same evidence that prevails today. Why did God allow robbers to be put on the cross with Christ, or that before him such and such impostors should be pointed out? So that we have terms of comparison, and so that the supremacy of truth appears to the eyes of the less clairvoyant, that we no longer see in him a brigand, another impostor, but that we understand the distance infinity that separates it, because nothing could have cast the slightest shadow on his glory, neither the fact of sharing the same treatment as the brigands, nor the appearance, at the same time, of these impostors. Say, indeed, that it is the cross and not the power of the crucified which was the author of the triumph. The supporters of Photius and Judas are there to provide a refutation. Their objectives were the same as ours. Signs accompanied their action, and they were many, but they were annihilated. I repeat to you, if God has permitted all this, it is to show superabundantly what is his own mark. He allowed false prophets to appear at the same time as the prophets, false apostles to appear at the same time as the prophets, to teach you that nothing that comes from him can receive umbrage from anything whatsoever. The ancient world pitted against the Christians. Do I have to show by another means the astonishing, incredible force which was at work in this preaching? Do I also bring you the proof that its adversaries themselves contributed to its growth, to its diffusion? Paul had enemies who preached the faith in Rome to put the finishing touch to the anger of Nero, who led the fight against him. They also took it upon themselves to preach, to widen the audience of the word and increase the number of disciples, and pushing the prince's fury to the limit, making the beast quite ferocious, in a word. This is what he affirms in his letter to the Philippians. I want you to know it, brethren. My affair has rather turned out for the profit of the gospel. Most of the brothers, emboldened because of my chains, redouble their intrepidity to spread the word without fear. Admittedly, there are some who do it out of malice, to stir up quarrels. But others do it out of complacency, really. Some, it is out of a spirit of intrigue, with an intention that is in no way pure, believing to aggravate the weight of my chains. Others out of love, knowing that I am here to defend the gospel. But after all, what does it matter? Somehow or other, for the wrong reasons or in the spirit of truth, Christ is announced. You have seen that many of them preach for reasons of base intrigue. Well, that did not prevent the word from imposing itself, and it did so thanks even to its adversaries. There were plenty of obstacles. Thus, the laws in force then were certainly not auxiliaries, but they were even an element of opposition. They maintained the war. And there was also the perversity and ignorance of the slanderers, who repeated, "They have a king, this Christ." They had no idea of royalty from on high. That royalty which should inspire sacred fear, that royalty without limits, alleging that the apostles were endeavoring to establish an empire over the whole earth. They poured out calumnies against them, and this was the struggle, fought on a common front, and by each of these enemies individually. On the one hand, from the point of view of the state, it was claimed that the established regime was going to be swept away, and that the laws were overthrown. On a private level, that each family was torn apart and disintegrating. Did we not see the father making war on his son, the son denying the father, the women their husbands, and the husbands their wives, the daughters denying their mother and each other of his relatives? Friends denying friends, in a kind of war with 1,000 faces, 1,000 forms. Who won the families? The members were divided, the assemblies of notables troubled. The courts plunged into confusion, as if the ancestral customs were being ruined, the festivals and the worship of the gods ruined too. In short, everything that the former legislators had made a point of seeing conserved with particular vigilance, above all else. Add to that the suspicions among the emperors, who chased Christians everywhere. And don't let anyone say that the difficulties were confined to the countries of Greek culture, while the Jews ensured peace. For the Jews were precisely much more ill-disposed. Did they not go so far as to accuse them of destroying the foundations of their own society? They do not cease, they said, to utter words of blasphemy against the holy place and against the law. Paul mastered this gigantic outburst. With what forces? So, while the fire is everywhere, that the fire breaks out in families, in cities, in the countryside, in the deserts. That it breaks out among the Greeks as among the Jews, among the princes as among the subjects, among close relatives as well. While the sea catches fire, the earth catches fire. Kings ignite and fury exacerbates each other. Rage is worse than that which animates wild animals. Here is that our blessed Paul leaps into this gigantic furnace, stands in the midst of the wolves. And in vain they attack him from all sides. Not only does he not allow himself to be crushed under the blows, but he brings all these people back to the way of the truth. Should I tell you, after that, about other fights, the most difficult ones? The fight against the false apostles, and the one that hurt him the most, the fight against the weakness of his disciples. Yes. Many were the faithful who allowed themselves to be spoiled. And Paul, there too, resists. But with what? With what forces? Our weapons, he says, have nothing to do with the order of the flesh. But they are capable, for the cause of God, of overthrowing fortresses, for we overthrow sophisms and every power proudly erected against the knowledge of God. That was what changed everything. That was what gave a different twist to all the vicissitudes. See the fire taking hold, it gradually gnaws the thorns, they curl up, disappear under the action of the flame. And there you have the fields purified. Well, it was enough for the words to come out of Paul's mouth, and more impetuously than a flame, for everything to give way. For everything to disappear before him, the cults of the divinities, festivals, great religious gatherings, ancestral customs, corrupting laws, collective passions, threats from princes, conspiracies in families, the dirty work of false apostles. Let us take an even better comparison. Watch the rays of the sun rise, the darkness flee. The wild beasts burrow and hide in their dens for the rest of the day, the bandits go away, and quickly the assassins return as fast as possible in their caves, the pirates disappear. and the grave robbers retreat, while the profligates, thieves and burglars, fearing that the light of the sun will accuse them, fade away. Everything becomes clear and luminous, the earth, the sea. For the rising rays spread their radiance everywhere, over the waters of the oceans and over the mountains, over the countryside and over the cities. Well, when the message was proclaimed by the herald, when Paul spread it everywhere, error was seen to flee, and the truth to make its way again. Grease and smoke of the sacrifices, cymbals and tambourines, drinking and orgies, fornications and adulteries, and all the rest, which one does not even dare to name, all that was perpetrated in the sanctuaries of the idols, all that ended, all was consumed. Like wax under the action of fire liquefied, everything was like straw devoured by fire. On the contrary, the luminous flame of truth was seen rising resplendent and gaining the heights of heaven itself, and all that was to hinder its rise only added to its momentum. All that was to block its path only added to his strength. The dangers could not suspend its impetuous, irresistible movement, any more than the tyranny of ancient practices, any more than the power of customs and ancestral laws or the difficulty of making the laws admit the implications of the divine teaching. No, nothing had any more weight. I would like you to understand the full force of the phenomenon that played out then. Threatened the heathen, I do not say perils, death in one form or another, nor starvation, but only a slight fine. You will see them instantly turn their conviction. But with us, nothing of such behavior. In vain we mutilated, assassinated our own people, waged war on them everywhere, and waged this war in 1,000 ways. Their conviction blossomed more and more. Oh, it is not worth mentioning the pagans of our time, vile and very contemptible people. No, take the example of the pagans of old, those whom we admired, those who tore cries of enthusiasm for their philosophy, a Plato, a Pythagoras, the philosopher of Clazomenes, and many others of the same size, and you will see better than the force of the preached message. After Socrates had drunk the hemlock, his disciples, for a part of them, withdrew to Megara. In fear of having the same fate, the others had to abandon their fatherland and freedom, and put aside a woman, only one. They had no ascendancy over anyone else. As for the philosopher of Citium, in spite of the writings of political philosophy that he left behind, he experienced the same erasure of his influence. And yet they had had nothing to hinder their journey, no danger had stopped them. They were not people without talent, they excelled in handling language, they had not lacked money, and they were a country that enjoyed universal fame. Well, with that, they had no result. This is what is very characteristic of error. Without anything disturbing it, it dissipates. And this is what characterizes the truth. It may be attacked from many sides, but it continues to expand. The simple reality of the facts is enough to proclaim it. Words and speeches are useless. The whole earth makes its voice heard, and all the points of the world, cities and countryside, continents and seas, inhabited countries, deserted countries, summits of mountains. For God did not leave the deserts aside from the dispensation of his bounty. He also filled them with all the good things he brought us from heaven, and this through the mouth of Paul, and by the grace that dwelt in him. And this grace shone, superabundant, in him, because he had, first, manifested a dynamism which had made him worthy of it. And it is thus that the greater part of the marvels that I have exposed are due to his word. So if God has done this honor to the human race to consider one of his members worthy of producing so many great things, let us be full of emulation, let us strive to imitate him. Let us strive to make ourselves similar to him. We too, and will not believe that it is unachievable. Ah, I will not stop repeating it, as I have already done. He had a body exactly like ours. He fed like us, his soul was exactly like ours. But, behold, his will was great, and his dynamism brilliant, and that is what made him as we see him. So no discouragement, no letting go. Take the required dispositions of mind, and nothing will prevent you from receiving the same grace. For God is no respect of persons. It is He who formed him, and it is still He who attracts you. He was her Lord, and He is yours as well. He has sounded the name of Paul, and He seeks to crown you also. Let us humbly present our persons to God. Let us purify ourselves, in order to receive, in our turn, the same superabundant gift and to obtain the same goods, with the grace and mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and power, now and forever and ever. Amen.